So let's look at our overall model if we are at the zero lower bound. Now, the zero lower bound impacts monetary policy, which will impact overall aggregate demand, but it has no impact on, fiscal policy or the IS curve. So we're just going to go ahead and start by drawing the IS curve normally. Now let's look at a point. So there's a few different things we want to make sure we understand here. The nominal interest rate is going to be equal to 0. That's what we call this zero lower bound. So the Fed is not going to be able to lower that interest rate any further. Remember that the Fisher equation is saying the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus inflation. And remember, our MP curve is telling us, well, the real interest rate that we want to set, right? That's the real interest rate the Fed wants to set, is going to be equal to some amount plus lambda times the inflation rate. So the idea is that you're trying to raise the real interest rate when inflation's going up. But because of the Fisher equation, which we went over a few weeks ago, the only way to do that is if you start to see inflation change, you've got to change that nominal rate. So let's kind of take a look and see what that's going to do to everything. And we could start with a point where whatever this, let's say that we're at this, we have an inflation rate that we care about, which is our target inflation rate. This is what we really want. So if I were to go up and if I know, right, so I'm just gonna make a random point. We don't know where this point's going to be. Let's just say it's right here. Okay, we're just going to say there's an initial point right here. I'll just call this point A. And if we're at the zero lower bound, right, I'll change colors here so you can see exactly how I'm calculating this. If I'm using this Fisher equation, the real interest rate will then be 0 minus whatever that target inflation rate is. So it's going to be negative target inflation rate. So this interest rate is just going to be negative whatever that target inflation rate is. So in the US, it's 2, so it's be like 2 and negative 2, and that's what you kind of see in this lesson. Okay. Now, what happens if the interest rate starts to increase? So let's just say we're at some other inflation. Let's call this just inflation rate H. So a high inflation rate. Well, as that inflation rate goes up, what do I want to do, right? What does the Fed want to do? Well, the Fed is going to want to end up trying to increase that real interest rate. The way they do that is they increase that nominal rate, which they can do, right? They can increase that nominal interest rate. So we'll see just kind of our normal upward sloping MP curve. So we're no longer at the zero lower bound on this part of that MP curve, right? So this will be my normal part of the MP curve. We're not at that zero lower bound. I can raise this up. So here's point B. And so if I go this over, and who knows what this inflation or this interest rate is going to be, but this is just some interest rate up here, whatever, just call it interest rate sub B because it's at point B. Okay, so the higher inflation rate, that. So what are we noticing? Well, there's a few things we're noticing. We can come over here to our IS curve and we can say, all right, here's that negative target rate that we're talking about. And so we're going to see that there's going to be a point here with this IS curve. And what we're going to notice is whatever that target rate is, let's say that target rate is right here, inflation target rate. We see there's going to be this point A. Now I want to show you with point B, right? If I do this point B, here's my real interest rate at point B. Here's my point B on the IS curve. And what we're going to see, as you know, because this is a higher level of the inflation higher level, which we've already created, is everything kind of looks normal. And we notice this right here, that's our aggregate demand curve, as we've seen so far. This isn't the interesting part. This is what we've already seen. What's interesting, which I'm going to change color so that we can really analyze this, is what happens if we see the inflation rate start to come down, but we are bound by the zero lower bound, right? Well, if that's the case, right? If inflation starts to go down, but I is equal to 0, what do we notice with this Fisher equation? Well, this means the real interest rate actually starts to go back up. So we're going to see some real interest rate, let's say right about here, point C. So the MP curve, once we hit that zero lower bound, the MP curve kinks and becomes downward sloping. Okay, well, what does that mean for our aggregate demand curve? Well, I can go over and I can say this is my real C. And what do I notice? Notice that when the inflation rate goes down, let's call this inflation rate L, what we're doing, if I match these up, is if this is point C, I'm getting a kink in my aggregate demand curve as well, and it starts to become upward sloping. So what we end up seeing is we end up seeing my aggregate demand curve having that exact same kink. So when we see inflation start to go down, maybe even become deflation, interest rates actually start to rise, causing output to fall, right? I didn't label any of these outputs, but you can see what's happening here, right? These are my different outputs. And the interesting one is right going from A to C. Because going from A to C, we see inflation decreasing, but that starts to push our output down. So we'll start to see what we call like deflationary spiral, and the automatic correction isn't going to happen, which we'll show in a future video. So this is what happens at the zero lower bound, right? So point A is the zero lower bound. And so as we start to want to lower the interest rates, we actually can't. And so it starts to kink back up.